So let's talk about the High Renaissance in Northern Europe. In the beginning of the Renaissance in Northern Europe, we had a major power established through Flanders and Burgundy. If you remember right, those were the four dukes of Burgundy. They were Charles the Bold, Richard the Lion-Hearted, and there were two others. Those main powers were created through alliances of marriage through Burgundy and the Netherlands, or Flanders to be exact. So my point is that Burgundy dissolves. It dissolves, and France, Italy, and Spain absorb them. Now, when I say Italy, actually what I mean is a Holy Roman Empire. This makes the Holy Roman Empire, France, and Spain stronger. Spain takes over as the dominant power. They do this through expansion of territory and through marital alliances. Art and architecture is used as propaganda to flaunt the wealth of the monarchy and to maintain social control. Artists start selling their art independently. This is made possible primarily by the invention of the printing press that happened in early Northern Renaissance and through printmaking in general. But the artist is still dependent on the monarchy and the church for major commissions. So the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter Reformation wage on. Ultimately, it splits the church into two main churches, the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church. But it fuels a very serious war that lasts for 100 years. And during this war, we see that the monarchy is able to intertwine their power through the war and use religion as social control. Artists are on the move. They're usually chasing large commissions, and they often move for religious freedom or to escape the war. Okay, so we are moving on to a new time period or a new art historical era. We are moving actually from Italy to Western Europe, and we're going to actually talk about something that's really, really important. I know that it was in the PowerPoints last week, but I want to be sure that you fully understand what the Protestant Reformation was. So there was this guy, and his name was Martin Luther, and he took a trip to Germany. And when he took a trip to Italy from Germany. And when he took this trip to Italy, he sees that the Pope is doing some unorthodox things in order to raise money. And he's doing some things that he feels are not biblical. For one thing, the Pope are having children out of wedlock. And they're practicing something called nepotism, which means they're appointing their relatives to important positions within the papacy. They've also are doing something called selling indulgences. The indulgences are small pieces of paper that are used to buy time off of heaven or out of purgatory, so that the owner of the indulgence gets to heaven more quickly. This is important because Martin Luther sees all these things and gets really upset. And he goes back to Germany and he nails a thesis, 95 thesis rules to the church door, and says that until these things are done, he will in no way, shape, or form step foot again in a church. And so there's a new movement in religion launched called the Protestant Reformation. As soon as the Protestant Reformation happens, the Catholics turn around and launch a counter Reformation. But let's look at works of art during the Protestant Reformation. Something that you need to know about the works of art in the Protestant Reformation is that they tend to not include figures. We're going to start with an artist named Tilman Ryman Schneider. Tilman Ryman Schneider was a wood carver, and his wood carvings were very intricate and very detailed. We're going to see some stylistic carryovers from classical antiquity here in Ryman Schneider's work. The one thing I want you to know is that, especially in parts of the Holy Roman Empire that were places like Germany, well, in France too, there were areas of specialization. In Ryman Schneider's area, the specialization was wood carving. But we will see that there are that metalwork becomes a very important area of specialization. In those areas of specialization, we find that France and the area in northern France tends to focus on metalwork, whereas Ryman Schneider and in Germany tend to focus on wood carving work. One of the things that is sort of dictates the area of specialization has to do with the topography of the land and the materials that are available in that area. For Ryman Schneider, he's working in the Rhine region of Germany, so wood from the Black Forest is very plentiful. Okay, so what you're looking at here is called the Ryman Schneider altarpiece. I know that we had talked about the fact that the Protestant Reformation brought about pieces that did not have people in them. Um, this particular piece actually has figures in it. Um, a lot of pieces that Ryman Schneider produced did not survive. We only actually have two of them that have survived. Most of the time, they didn't survive due to neglect, fire, and the practice of iconoclasm um, that was prevalent after the Protestant Reformation. If you don't know what iconoclasm is, you should look it up. It was in the last PowerPoint, and so you should know what that is. This altar piece actually marks the spot where there was said to be a drop of Jesus' blood. And so that makes this altarpiece a relic. A relic is a holy object that is considered to be holy because of it has some sort of significance to the religion or faith. There are other relics that contain things like bones of saints, or the beard of Jesus, or a piece of hair of Mary's, or oil that was spread on Jesus' feet. So there are lots of relics in the world. If you happen to live near Cleveland, you can go to the Cleveland Museum of Art and see a very large collection of relics. The Ryman Schneider altarpieces consisted of four main elements: a central section, or what we call the corpus, that houses the figures, the hinged wings, which were normally decorated with some sort of carving or relief, and were often open on Sundays and most holy days, and the predella. The predella is the piece at the bottom where the worshiper would kneel and have something to look at while he was praying. Predella often. Here, I just wanted to show you the detailed viewpoint of the figures. You can see that Ryman Schneider uses this linear treatment for the clothing. The linear treatment is a throwback from the classical era. So humanism comes to play here because of that. But you can see that the heads tend to be a little bit larger And we get large hands that Ryman Schneider sort of carries throughout the figures, creating a style that's uniquely his own. The linear treatment of the fabrics give them a voluminous feel. So he uses a lot of lines and deep cuts into the wood to give us the idea that the figure is wearing a large amount of robing. That large amount of robing is also a throwback to classical antiquity. So this type of altarpiece actually has four sections. The superstructure, that's the structure that jets up into the ceiling space. The winged hinges, these are just like in a triptych. The hinges open and close. This is basically a three-dimensional triptych. And so the hinged wings usually are decorated with scenes from, well, they're decorated in relief carving. And the scenes usually mimic whatever the main message of the piece is. The central section is called the corpus, and it houses the figures. And at the very bottom, there's a predella, just like what we saw in the triptych. This is artist Albrecht Dürer. He was considered the Leonardo of the North. He was a painter, a mathematician. He liked to study human proportions and perspective. We are now in the High Renaissance of Northern Europe, and he is the first and foremost most important painter of the High Renaissance of Northern Europe. He took an important trip to Italy in 1494. It was actually his honeymoon. Funny thing about that honeymoon is that his wife never went with him. His father was a goldsmith, and he pushed him to do art because his father knew that he was very talented. They also knew that Dürer had some interesting sexual issues because it's been recorded that he was prescribed aphrodisiacs. He didn't particularly like his wife. He often includes ways of toying with our intellect when he does paintings. And so let's look at his artwork. This is our So this famous piece by Albrecht Dürer is a really important piece of artwork. It is a carving or an engraving, but believe it or not, is done in wood and not in metal engraving. So that's kind of an important distinction. If you look really carefully, it's kind of hard to believe that this piece is actually wood engraving and not a metal engraving. This piece of artwork is based on the Book of Revelation and figures that are described in the Book of Revelation in the Bible. The four figures are conquest, war, plague and famine, and death. Conquest is represented by a rider who has a crown and wears a bow and is on the white horse. He is the rider that is furthest back in the piece. War, which carries one sword. Plague and famine have a set of scales, and death is the rider with the sickly horse. Dürer illustrates these four horsemen decimating the population. We think that he didn't carve his own wood blocks, but hired a person to do it for him. The carver would have followed the drawing that Dürer submitted to him. Dürer had training as a goldsmith, and we can see this in his attention to detail. Dürer's rendition of Adam and Eve. It is a metal engraving, not a wooden engraving. And you can see that Dürer is really interested in the proportions of the body. He often dissected cadavers and was very good If you recall, I told you that Durr was a mathematician, and so he had a real eye for proportion and scale and the idea of something being a percentage of size of something else. In Durr's engraving of Adam and Eve, you can see that he uses a lot of symbolism, which is a stylistic characteristic of Northern European art. However, you can see, unlike the early Northern European art, it is a lot more detailed and the figures are very precise. Each of the animals here represent a disguised symbol. The cat represents colic. The bird sits on a sign that actually is Durr's signature. Let's see. The ox represents phlegm of the human body. So remember that Durr was interested in medicine, but also Northern European art usually has interesting interlacing meanings in their art in terms of things that we wouldn't normally associate with an ox, for example, equaling phlegm. And so it's common in Northern European art that we're seeing elements that we wouldn't normally associate with that particular item or thing that's in the artwork. So here we're going to talk about Albrecht Dürer's The Four Apostles. Dürer paints this work of art without the security of a commission, and he paints it and presents it to the city's fathers for the city of Nuremberg's town hall. It was displayed by the fathers in the town hall, and remember that the town hall is a civic space. The painting showcased Dürer's ability to individualize and humanize the four apostles. He very much wanted to display his ability to take a biblical figure and make them feel as if they were real people here on earth. He individualizes them very much so, and he places them within the painting based on importance. He shows Peter with the keys. John holds a book. Mark stands behind Paul, and Mark admires Paul. Peter is not quite savvy, and he is the favorite of the Catholic Church. Paul is actually the favorite of Martin Luther, and he paints the Bible being open to John 1:1, which is a passage about the sovereignty of the Bible. At the bottom of the painting, he states that the information about the Bible in German, which is Luther's native language. Remember, Durer is from the Netherlands, and so he would speak Dutch. So this painting very much aligns Durer with sympathies for the Catholic side of the Reformation. One of the things that I want to be sure that you fully understand is the idea that Durer was a Catholic. While he has Protestant sympathies, he was actually a Catholic and making works of art for the Catholic Church. Therefore, he is not subject to the same rules that the Protestants dictated within their churches. Protestant churches at the time were very plain. They did not have works of art inside of them. That is because one of the things that Martin Luther was upset about was that they were using icons instead of having actual religious figures there for important religious ceremonies. And that's why iconoclasm began. This painting is what we consider pro-Protestant painting. It is a reflection of his sympathies for the Protestant Reformation in art. And that's why the people are very humanistic looking, they're very realistic looking. And I think it's really important that you read in your textbook about this particular piece, the Four Apostles. Okay, so what we're looking at here is the Eisenheim altarpiece. It was began around 1510, and it is a polytic. In other words, it has many panels that open and close. It reflects Catholic belief and doctrine, and we can see the lamentation on the predella. It was created for a monastic hospital, and it depicts Saint Sebastian. He's pictured on the left, and Saint Anthony is the abbot depicted on the right. Both saints were associated with the plague and disease and miraculous cures. And so, this particular piece of artwork, being in the monastic hospital, would be a place for people to go when they had a loved one that was sick, and to kneel and pray in the chapel, or for the actual people who are sick themselves to go and kneel and pray. The outside view, which is what you're looking at now, or the closed view, is the one that people would see every day of the week. And so the one that people are seeing every day of the week is kind of morbid. It has a sense of preaching to the people who are ill that sickness is ugly and reflects original sin. The politic was placed in the choir of the church, and like I said, the church was next to the monastic hospital. It really was set as a therapy of hope for people who would visit to pray for the healing. The color has a sense of dissonance. The red is very shocking, and it's meant to get your attention as a viewer. And it's meant for the viewer to repent and contemplate their sins. So this is... We're moving on to Hans Holbein the Younger. Holbein takes over as leading artist after Durer in the Northern Renaissance scene in about the mid-1500s. He is a painter for the court of Henry VIII, and his talents as a painter showcase his love of texture, detail, and accuracy. He has a strong sense of composition and a subtle linear patterning. Holbein is a master at realistic portraiture, just like Van Eyck was, but he also incorporates the Italian ideas of monumental composition and sculptural form. Okay, so this painting is a really important painting of the Protestant Reformation. You just read about artist Hans Holbein the Younger. He takes over for Durer in the Northern European area for Henry VIII. He's the court painter. It's a double portrait of George de Seville and Jean de Dintville. Both men are humanists, and they exhibit a collection of objects that they've collected through trading from around the world. Their knowledge of world education is laid before you on the table that they stand in front of. The worldly cultures that they've experienced are presented there in front of you. You can see a lute with a broken string, mathematical and astronomical models and implements. We see a compass, a sundial, flutes, globes, and an open hymnal. These two men are fur traders, and it shows that Hans Holbein had some incredible talent as a Northern Renaissance painter. We can see his love of texture and the detail and the accuracy that he uses in depicting, for example, the features of the face or the texture of the drapes. It has some strong linear patterning in it, especially in the fabric. It also has a strong sense of composition. Holbein is a master at realistic portraiture, just like Jan van Eyck was. He incorporates, though, the new Italian ideas of that monumental composition, the sculptural form, and we really see a parallel going on between the High Renaissance in Italy and the High Renaissance in Northern Europe. The High Renaissance in Italy are masters at sculpture. They have every little detail of sculpture down to a science, and the High Renaissance painters in Northern Europe are masters at painting. They have every little detail of painting down to a perfect science. You can see that there's a long gray shape that comes diagonally across the canvas. It's called an anamorphic form. It's a distorted image that's only recognizable with a special mirror, and by looking at the painting at an obscure angle. If you turn the painting just right and the mirror just right, the image becomes a skull. The image was meant to remind the viewer of their own mortality. And there is also a skull on Dentville's medallion and his hat. You can also see a crucifix half hidden in the upper left-hand corner. And these items were to encourage the viewer to think about their own death and the idea of resurrection. This piece really is a representation of the growing tension between secular and religious authority during this time. In other words, it's that tension that's going on between the secular leaders and the religious authority leaders. Dentville is a titled landowner, and Georges de Seville was a bishop. So we have that dynamic also going on in the painting. But we also see an inclusion of Martin Luther's translations in the book next to the lute with the broken string, which is a symbol of discord. It refers to the religious strife that's going on. These two men are French ambassadors, and it illustrates the state of France in the early 16th century. And so this is a very important painting because it is a historical record of what's going on in France at the time. This is Lucas Cranach the Elder's Nymph of the Spring, done in 1537. It is oil on a wood panel. It's in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. Cranach was the court painter for the electors of Saxony for most of his career. He's known for his portraits. They are both of his portraits are of German princes and leaders of the Protestant Reformation. He was a close friend of Martin Luther, and so he's the natural selected person or naturally selected artist because he was close friends with Martin Luther. Throughout his career, he paints nude subjects drawn from mythology and religion. Classical legend proposed that the statue of a nymph was found on the banks of the Danube River, and so this is the subject of the painting Nymph of the Spring. Her nudity is really emphasized by the jewels and the flimsy veils that you see lying along her body. They sort of grace her curves. They are an option to show some sense of modesty, but still show the entire nude full. There's a Latin inscription that warns, "I am the nymph of the sacred spring. Do not disturb my sleep. I am resting." Coyly, however, the nymph peers through her half-opened eyes, and her bow and quiver of arrows are attributes of the goddess Diana, who is a mythological goddess of the hunt, and she symbolizes chastity. Thus, the subject is sort of tantalizing yet ambiguous. In 1508, the Saxon Duke nobilizes Cranach for his art, which was a common thing in this time You'll see that Velázquez gets nobilized as well. So the Nymph of the Spring really is part of that Protestant Reformation painting. She comes with a warning, and she represents chastity. And so her warning is be careful. Um, be careful, don't disturb the sleep of chastity, uh, because the bow and arrow will capture you in love. This painting is from a series that combines earth with sensuality. It's supposed to serve as a warning against the pleasures of the flesh. You see this woman, she's standing alone, nude in the forest, and death comes upon her and takes her by surprise. Due to the Protestant Reformation, the Protestant Church is forbidding paintings of a religious subject matter. So artists often painted moral lessons through grotesque or mythological subject matter, just like we saw in the Nymph of the Spring. This is by Hans Baldingrein. He was nicknamed the Green, which was his favorite color. He was born into a wealthy family and was part of Durr's workshop beginning in 1505. His main artistic home was Strasbourg, Germany. He was a painter, a printmaker, and a stained glass artisan. You can see there's often a question I pose to my students. Which of the two images do you think is more sensual? Do you think that Balding's image is more sensual, with death taking surprise of the nymph that's standing in the forest? Or do you think Cranach's nude reclining on the Danube River is more sensual? They're both basically for the same purpose. The purpose was to warn of the pleasures of the flesh. So this is Groen's Witches' Sabbath. It was done in 1510, and it's a woodcut. It is what we call a chiaroscuro woodcut. A chiaroscuro woodcut is a printmaking technique in which the artist carves the block in which he's going to print the imagery from. And then he carves an additional block that has highlights and values in it. So the dark spots and the light spots in the print. So 2 woodcuts are created. The imagery woodcut is then printed, and then on top of that, the highlights and the dark values are printed on top of the imagery print. This creates a print that has a lot more value contrast. It creates a print that allows for more round volumes. And so for Groen, the reason to use a chiaroscuro woodcut for this work of art versus a regular woodcut would be because he's depicting people that are in a forest, and so he wants to get those really dark darks that you get from a being inside a shaded area, but also the highlights that come from, in this case, the imagery would be the moon. So this is a clever way to create a wood block print that gives strong amount of highlight and contrast to the imagery. Groen's dealing with the imagery is really fascinating. He is sort of enthralled by witchcraft. Witchcraft is a counter belief of Christianity, and so he's really interested in exploring it. He never depicts anything but women in the witchcraft. And witchcraft in the 1500s was associated with devil worshipping, and of course, brewings and potions and things that we think of when we think of witches. Um, they were fabled to create potions that they would then rub on their skin, which would cause them to hallucinate. And when they hallucinated in their visions, they were flying on brooms or on goats. The church actively sought out finding witches to torture them and make them confess their transgressions against God, or to get rid of them altogether. Groyne also fascinatingly enjoys exploring the themes of original sin. He blames women for the original sin, because Eve tempted Adam with the apple, according to Christian lore, in the Garden of Eden. So anyway, this is an interesting image that Groyne creates. You saw the one prior to it, Death in the Matron. And so you kind of get a sense that he's very interested in things of the spiritual world that are unseen, or the things of the spiritual world that have evil in them. So during the Renaissance in France, Pope Leo X aligns with King Francis I. This is a portrait of King Francis I. Francis employs Da Vinci to advise him in architectural matters. But in all actuality, they were friends, and Francis really just enjoyed Leonardo's company. Francis believed in an Italian-inspired Renaissance for France. And so one of the artists that Francis employs is Jean Clout. Clout was Flemish and a portrait painter, and the king had some pretty intense facial flaws that Clout disguises in this portrait with elaborate costuming and soft highlighting in the face. You can see that he makes the hat very large to offset the elongated nose that King Francis has. He has a cleft chin, and so he uses the beard to sort of hide that. He also is rumored to have been a fairly small man in stature, and so the large, billowy sleeves of the garment that he wears help to make him seem more regal, more intimidating, more broad, etc. France was really caught in political turmoil due to the Reformation. They are next to Spain and Italy, who are both Catholic, but they have alliances with people in the north. France is more influenced by those Germanic tribes or Germanic peoples that are in the north. And so France is in a delicate situation. They really, in order to choose sides, alienate themselves from someone that they border with in terms of country. I just kind of wanted to give you a face with the name here. You can see John Calvin in the upper left-hand corner and Pope Leo X below him, and then Catherine de' Medici here to the right. De' Medici became regent because the person who was to inherit the throne after Francis was too young to rule. And so the concept of the regent becomes a very common thing in court. It's basically a person is appointed to make political decisions on behalf of the person who would inherit the throne. In this case, the person who inherited the throne was young, and so de' Medici would have been regent until the young man was of age to make decisions as a king. This is El Greco. He's really one of the most well-known artists in the High Renaissance, from Spain. He was born in Crete, which is in Greece, and he was trained as an icon painter, which makes sense because he was born in Greece. Um, he has sort of a non naturalistic bias in his work, and it showcases a talent that will sort of follow in many of his pieces. He creates work during the course of his career, and you can see the icon influence from sort of the beginning through to the end. He moves to Venice in 1567 because Crete was considered a Venetian territory. Venice makes sense to move to the capital, basically. In Venice, he makes it his goal to master the form of Renaissance painting. Now, remember, Venetian Renaissance is different than Roman Renaissance. The Venetian Renaissance has a more soft, sensual form to it, and the Venetian Renaissance paints primarily on the canvas. The form is constructed through color. They follow the colore path, not the disegno path like Michelangelo, but the colore path like Titian and Giorgione. In Venice, he wants to include a figural style. He wants to include perspective in his tricks of the trade, and he wants to sort of create and stage elaborate narratives. He also writes a treatise about painting, and his style of art influences the art world. Let's look at one of his most famous paintings. Okay, so let's talk about El Greco's most famous work, The Burial of Count Orgaz. El Greco moves from Venice and lives and works in Rome from about 1570 to 1576. It's about 6 years. And by the end of the 6 years, he moves back to Spain. There he becomes a royal painter for Philip II. His most famous painting, El Greco first draws and then paints. Remember I told you that El Greco moved to Venice, where he would have learned the Venetian style. Now he's in Rome and he's learning the style of high Renaissance painting in Rome. The Burial of Count Orgaz was commissioned by the parish priest Santo Tome in Toledo, Spain in 1586. It's a celebration of financial obligation that people have to the church, which no doubt was influential from Rome. Remember, Rome at the time is building the new St. Peter's, and they're charging indulgences to build the new St. Peter's. The picture is meant to serve as the real world of the viewer and the fictional world, seen through two separate sections. The worldly one is the one at the bottom, and the heaven is the one at the top. Remember I told you that El Greco was an icon painter originally. Originally, he was trained to study the icons throughout history. This separation of the world and the heavens is something that is common in icon paintings, especially icon paintings that came from central Italy. This particular work of art is really central to understanding the relationship that the art world has to El Greco and his work in general. It captures the essence of his art, which tends to be a visionary experience, and it really hasn't been duplicated by any other artist in the Renaissance time. So the subject of this particular painting is a secular and religious image. It has expressive exaggeration. He uses an unnatural sense of color, which is influential from the Mannerist style. It isn't Mannerist, but it does have some Mannerist qualities. It has a sense of spirituality and a sense of emotionalism, a sense of non-physical properties that no doubt was an influence of his training in Venice. We see the burial of Count Orgaz, and this painting would have been part of the Orgaz family chapel. It's a funerary painting. We see figures vested in fine fabrics. There's a Franciscan monk in a rough habit. There is a division between the heaven and the earth, which we talked about just a minute ago. We think that El Greco saw Michelangelo's Last Judgment, and that the Last Judgment was sort of a jumping off point for El Greco here. At the top, you see a bank of clouds that leads us to sort of give into the space. The upper register seems to come frontally, parallel to the burial of Count Orgaz in terms of space. So right at the very forefront of the picture plane, you have this woman dressed in blue and red who is the Madonna. And then the upper register sort of recedes into space. The lower register recedes into space as well by overlapping of people. You have Count Orgaz at the front of the picture plane and the monk in the rough habit. And then all the people that are stacked sort of behind him, you see like a crowd, helps to develop the amount of space that El Greco is trying to present to you in terms of depth of the composition. So this is Hieronymus Bosch. He was one of the most prolific painters in the Netherlands in the late 1500s. His work was controversial, and the work that I would say was the most famous that he did is called The Garden of Earthly Delights. Your book points out, and I have read many interpretations of what the painting The Garden of Earthly Delights means. No one really can agree. Many scholars have many theories. However, we do know that his paintings influenced surrealism, and that one of his patrons was Henry III of Nassau, who was the regent to the Netherlands. So one of the most interesting painters that we study from Northern Europe is Hieronymus Bosch. Bosch was a really interesting painter. He collected material or source references from a book called The Bestiaries. We know that he was a chemist and had some other really unusual things that influenced his art. In the closed version of the triptych, we see a view of the Earth, and we see that he thinks that the Earth is flat, even though at this time Columbus has sailed already, in that we know that the Earth is round. He still seems to think it is flat. At any rate, the closed version of the triptych is done in Grisaille. If you don't know what Grisaille is, it's typed out for you in the upper left-hand corner. You need to look that up. It is an important term. So I kind of walked you through an explanation of every single thing that you could see in the painting. Here, I've just kind of pulled out some of the scenes so that you could see a close up of the scenes. So the top here, this is from the central panel where the earthly delights are explored. And I happened to mention that one of the panels had an African woman who was teaching young women about other things. That panel is pictured here below. Now, how do I know she's African? It's an accepted dogma about this particular work of art, but I will tell you this is one of the most controversial works of art in the history of Western art. And because of that, I would tell you that you can find many interpretations that say this woman is not African, she's from someplace else. So I just wanted to put that out there that, yeah, I realize there's some bias being underlined in that interpretation. Up above the couple that are in the middle of the birds. If you remember right, I told you that the birds become synonymous for seeking out sex, and the couple is sitting in the middle of the seeking out sex. As you look at the top, you see a couple riding in this bubble on top of a piece of fruit. Remember, fruit is also synonymous for sexual pleasure. And you can see that they're floating in a lake. There's a rat that's crawling into a tube, and there's a person in the tube watching out from below. This is a detail from the scene of hell. You can see the Eggman that I mentioned here. He's well, I'm sorry, not the Eggman. It's a half a torso that's been hollowed out. People are living inside the torso. The face is watching as people live inside his body. You can see the ears that I mentioned with the knife coming through them. And then in the lower right-hand corner, you can see this man that's sort of the ringleader of hell. Here's a close-up of the man who is the ringleader. He's eating people. And then you can see this egg in which somebody's suspended or trapped. The message of this painting was that the pleasures of the flesh bring about consequences in hell. Hieronymus Bosch even explores the idea of sex all the way back to original sin, which is here in the representation of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. One of the things I wanted to mention is that we think this might have been a wedding gift, because weddings were often commemorated with paintings that were given or tapestries. We think that it might have been a wedding gift to the groom, presenting the idea that these are the dangers of straying from fidelity in the marriage. So this is a Protestant scene. It is Quentin Massey's The Money Changer and his wife. This scene is depicting a moralizing lesson for greed. The painting has subtle religious symbols and an intense study of domestic interiors and daily life. This type of art replaces art in churches to instruct faithfulness. This is a very old-fashioned painting. It's an indication of money in Antwerp. If you were in Antwerp and you lived in that time when you saw this painting, you would automatically know that this painting was an indication of money and the moral trappings of it. I will include in one of the Delve Deeper activities an activity for this painting. This painting is a fascinating painting in that it talks about how society is reflected in this painting. You see the money changer. He runs his own business, and his business is exchanging currency. You can see in this mirror up close to the picture plane the outside world being reflected in it. The wife, she's reading her book of hours. A book of hours is a collection of daily prayers. So she's being devout, and she is looking on to what her husband's doing. You can see behind them symbols of prosperous and moral handling of the money. This is Catherine von Hemissen. She's from Holland, and she actually paints for Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg. What's happening is the Protestant merchant class and the peasants are seeking independence from Spain. Remember, I said at the beginning of this, Spain was the bigwig in control. There was an accumulation of wealth in the Netherlands, and so portraits increased in popularity. Portraits were a sign of wealth because you had to have money in order to be able to commission a portrait. But it was also the only way they had to record their lineage in the family. And so those generations after generations of people who carried on the legacy of the family was something that they really wanted to record. And so portraiture increased because the middle class becomes more and more wealthy. The self-portrait is the first known Northern European self-portrait by a woman. Here we see Catherine von Hemissen. She looks directly out at the viewer. That is unique because mostly at this time, women were not allowed to look up at the world. They would veer their gaze down towards the floor. Looking one in the eye could appear aggressive, but here is a sign of confidence. And she presents herself to the world, or to the Northern European Western world, as an artist who is skilled. She is currently in the painting a portrait of herself. She's in the middle of her work, and she interrupts her work to look at us, the viewer. She holds brushes and a palette and a mahl stick. The mahl stick was used to balance on the frame of the painting. We always see paintings framed from this time period, and it's because the frame was an important tool within the painting. They would take a mahl stick, and balance it on the canvas so that the artist could rest their hand along the mahl stick as they painted, help to relax the body and get more fine detail within the painting. The mahl stick steadies the hand. Unlike today, whenever you do a work of art like that, you had to build those muscles in by just painting and holding the brush up and having enough control to use those little tiny movements. So we don't tend to pre-frame our work, but they did in the Northern European Renaissance time as well as in the Italian Renaissance time, because it was a helpful tool. Catherine von Hemissen's father was Jan Sanders van Hemissen, and he was a well-known painter. He trained her. Women had a hard time being part of art back then because unless they had a father who was an artist or a brother, sometimes an uncle, but most of the time, unless the family was a family of artists, women were not deemed as important enough to educate for them to start their own business as an artist. Here she's painting herself at the age of 20. She wears fancy clothing. She wears clothing that aligns her with the upper middle merchant class. And you can see the fine fabrics in which her dress boasts. They are made of velvet, and then the sleeves have this beautiful silk that sort of pinches out between the fabric of the seam of the sleeve. Okay, Peter Bruegel the Elder is one of the more important painters that we'll study for Northern Renaissance in Europe. One of the reasons is because he paints a reflection of society's structure. This particular painting that we see is a hunting scene. You can see that the men are going out hunting. They're slogging through the snow. It's hard work. The dogs are exhausted from racing through the woods to hunt with the men. You can see that the servants are working with the fire in the house behind the hunters. And you can see then the rich or the wealthy people enjoying the snow and playing in the landscape, in the ice below. Let's look at another painting or illustration from Peter Bruegel. So this illustration is once again an illustration about the social classes of society in the Netherlands. I think what you're seeing here are calendar illustrations. Often we're looking at winter scenes or summer scenes. This particular scene is a harvest scene. And it is called The Harvesters. It's on a wood. It's oil on a wood panel, and it actually belongs to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. You can see that the workers are stacking hay, or they're bundling the hay for the harvest. And the harvest or the landscape in this area of the world is much like our Great Plains states that grow a large wheat crop, like in Kansas or in Nebraska or Iowa. And so you can see that the wheat is very tall. It grows all the way to their head, and it kind of takes over the landscape in terms of color. It's very golden, and you can just picture in your head, if you were standing there looking from a bird's eye view, that the entire landscape would be full of gold patches from the wheat needing to be harvested. You can see the workers, they're working very hard. The worker in the white shirt in the center there that's stepping out of the harvest looks exhausted. He's really tired. The other workers are hand cutting the hay. You can see those threshing blades that are being used to pull down the hay stalks. And some of the workers are taking a break. You can see the guy taking a siesta under the tree, relaxing. But the thing that separates the social classes is that they're a group of wealthier people with hats on and lovely dresses that aren't wearing work clothes, that are sitting under the shade of the tree, and they're resting. They're relaxing, they're eating their lunch, there's a plentiful basket of lunch, whereas the people that are working very hard and they're very tired. And so this is really important painting because it depicts what the social class system is like in Northern Europe at this time. This is El Greco. He's really one of the most well-known artists in the High Renaissance from Spain. He was born in Crete, which is in Greece, and he was trained as an icon painter, which makes sense because he was born in Greece. He has sort of a non-naturalistic bias in his work, and it showcases a talent that will sort of follow in many of his pieces. He creates work during the course of his career, and you can see the icon influence from sort of the beginning through to the end. He moves to Venice in 1567 because Crete was considered a Venetian territory. Venice makes sense to move to the capital, basically. In Venice, he makes it his goal to master the form of Renaissance painting. Now, remember, Venetian Renaissance is different than Roman Renaissance. The Venetian Renaissance has a more soft, sensual form to it, and the Venetian Renaissance paints primarily on the canvas. The form is constructed through color. They follow the colore path, not the disegno path like Michelangelo, but the colore path like Titian and Giorgione. In Venice, he wants to include a figural style. He wants to include perspective in his tricks of the trade, and he wants to sort of create and stage elaborate narratives. He also writes a treatise about painting, and his style of art influences the art world. Let's look. Richter. He was considered the Leonardo of the North. He was a painter, a mathematician. He liked to study human proportions and perspective. We are now in the High Renaissance of Northern Europe, and he is the first and foremost most important painter of the High Renaissance of Northern Europe. He took an important trip to Italy in 1494. It was actually his honeymoon. Funny thing about that honeymoon